This is video 7 in the Standard Library Fixed Objects module, and in this video we will be focusing on separating. So the opposite of batching. This time we'll look at separating. And in this video we will look at the separate object from the Standard Object Library, and then we will build two models, or we'll build one model and then extend that model to support the subsequent workshop. The separator object has a single input, so entities arrive from the network or from free space through the input node, coming into an input buffer, have a processing station, and then we have two outputs, one for the parent and one for the members. So in essence, it's the opposite of the combiner where we had parent and member input. This time we have a parent and member output. There are two basic modes for the separator. In one, a previously combined batch is separated into the original parent and member entities. So we would set, like as we saw previously, when we use a combiner to create a combined entity. In this mode, we would then separate those back into their original state. The separator can also be used to clone an entity, or to create a new copy of another entity type. And so, for example, if we were modeling an airport passenger check-in, we might want to use the separator to, once a passenger checks in, we would use the separator to create corresponding luggage entities. So the luggage entities would be the members, the parent would be the passenger. And so in this case, they would go presumably to different locations in the model, and then we would combine them later, or somehow need to be able to reconnect those back up. And so that's an example where we would use the separator where we had not previously created a combined entity. So let's take a quick look at the separator object. Jump into Simio here, and let's just grab an instance and place it and look at some of the properties. And so, as I said, there are two basic separation modes. Actually, there are three, but two of them are kind of related. We can either split the batch, where we've previously used a combiner. We can also make copies, and there are two options for making copies. There's create new without copying any of the entity attributes, and then we can make copies where you do copy the entity attributes. So if I select that again, we can look down here in separation mode. And so there are quantities, split quantities, and so on that facilitate customization of how the split occurs. As with the combiner, the separator is basically a server with the additional copying separation logic. So you have the same process logic, buffer logic, reliability, and so on that we've already seen. But it's primarily this separation mode and the related properties in the separation logic that make this different from the server object that we've seen before. So let's build a model where we use both the combiner and the separator. So we're going to have a very simple model where we have a parent and a member, and we're combining two members with each parent, and then we will go through a process, a server process, and then we will then separate the entity back to the original parent and two member entities. So let's jump into Simio, and let's just build the model. And so from a model building perspective, the way I usually build models is I place all of the object instances that I know, then connect those up, and then go through and adjust or set the properties accordingly. So for this one, we need two sources. So I'm going to just double click on the source object in the standard library. That puts me in multi-place mode, which I can get out of by either right clicking or hitting escape. So there are my two sources. I know I'm going to combine. And then I'm going to go use a server to do the processing on the combined entity. I'm then going to use a separator to go back to the original components, and then I'm going to create two syncs here. Let me just scroll over here a little bit. There's sync 1, and there's sync 2. So there we are, our basic object instances. So now we're going to connect these up. We're going to use path objects. So let's just double click on path. We're going to say source 1 is going to create the parent. Source 2 is going to create the members. Then from the combiner to the server. Then from the server to the separator. The parent entities are going to go to sync 1. and the member entities are going to go to sync 2 after they've been separated. So that's our basic model structure, pretty straightforward. And so now if we just run without changing any properties whatsoever, what we see is we're creating the same entity instances. They're going into the combiner. Since we haven't specified any properties, we're going to have one parent with one member. They're served, they go to the separator, and then they depart. Okay, so now what we're going to want to do is create our two different entity instances. So let's create two different entity instances. There's one, there's another, and let's rename these. I'm going to rename it parent entity and member entity. Let's see, member entity, and we'll make one of them red because that's what we had in the slide. So just choose color red and member. So now I have two entity instances, and I need to make sure that the corresponding source creates the right entity type. So we go to source 1, it creates the parent entity. I go to source 2, and by default it also creates the parent entity. And the reason it does that is because when we first placed source 2, we hadn't defined two different entities, so it created the default entity. When we rename the default entity, then that name change propagated. So we can fix that by just going in and saying I'm going to create a member entity. And so now what I would do when I'm creating this is I would go ahead and run it and make sure that it's behaving as I expect. And so again, we're creating red, we're creating green ones, they're connecting. I can't see the entities in the batch, but we'll come back to that in a little bit later. If I jump over to the separator, I can now also see that when a combined entity departs the separator, the original parent exits here and the original member exits there. And so we have matched our expectation. This is what we expected to happen. And as you're building models, it's always a great idea to develop some expectation and then make sure that the model matches the expectation, or that you determine that your expectation was incorrect. And so we'll do that throughout the semester throughout the course as we build models. So next we'll go in and adjust some of the object properties. And so for the parent entity, we want to use an exponential distribution with 1/2 interarrival times of 1/2 minute, because we're going to combine two members with each parent. And so if these arrive with an interarrival time of 1/2 and the members arrive with an interarrival time of 1/4, and we combine two, then we should have matched the two arrival rates. So we next go to our combiner and change the batch quantity to 2. And so now we should have two members matching each parent. And so again, step back, run the model a little bit, and make sure that it's behaving as expected. So now we should see two entities departing. And if we look, just pause it here, if I can pause it at the right time here, next time an entity arrives. There we go. Oops, missed it. But what we're seeing is it only looks like one entity. But the reason is because we have passing set to true by default on the path object. So I'm going to go back in and change allow passing to false. And then I'm going to execute again. Execute again, and now we should explicitly see the two entities being separated, which in fact we do. And so this is again another example of how we want to make sure that we have expectation and that we make sure that our model meets our expectation, where initially it didn't seem like it did because it looked like only one entity was departing. But when we explore further, we remember that passing is set to true by default. And so we fixed the model so that it does meet our expectation before we move on to the next step in the customization. So next we want to actually see the batching as we saw in the previous, when we did the symbits in the previous video. So let's go to the parent entity, and if I click on the parent entity and then look at the draw queue item in the ribbon, we see an option for batch members, and we can just draw the batch member queue. I'm just going to draw it above the entity for the time being, just so we can see what it looks like. And so now when I click on it, I can see that this is attached to the parent entity and it's the batch member queue. And so when I now run my model, oops, I'm always stopping it at the wrong place. There we go. Now we can see here's an entity and here's the batch member queue. And we can manipulate that queue if we don't like the way this looks. So it looks like they're moving backwards. So of course I can go back in and say, well, let's flip these around. There we go. So now they should be all facing in the same direction. So we can run. And now they're facing in the same direction. If we want to see the animation like we saw on the slide, so let me jump back to the slide here, you can see that we have a big symbol for the parent, and then the members are inside. We can do that also. So let me jump back in and say stop the model. And I'm going to do a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to move this out of the way a little bit. And then let's just make this bigger. There we go. That looks like it's big enough. And then I'm going to move the queue back. I'm going to jump in 3D mode, and if you look at 3D mode, you can see that these are the batch queue is at the same Y level as the entity, so I'm going to raise it up by holding the Shift key, and then I'm just going to raise it to make sure it's higher than the top of the member entity. I'm sorry, the parent entity, so that when I drag it and place it, it shows up on top. And so now we have our model set up. Let's see where we can actually see the entities, and they are, if we switch to 3D mode, in this case, batched above, so that we can actually see them when we run the animation. So if we run a little more, you can see now that we have essentially the model that we showed in the PowerPoint, where we have one parent entity being batched with two members, going to a server to be processed, and then separated back into their two constituent components. So the last thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to make a modification to the model we just built so that we can model using reusable palettes. And the reason we're doing this is to kind of set us up for the workshop, which we will do next. And so we're going to modify the model so that instead of destroying or sending the parent entities to the sink, we're going to send them back to the combiner. And we're going to, instead of creating new palettes using an in-arrival time, we're going to have a fixed number of parent entities that will then recirculate. So in order to do that, let me jump back into our model here. We need to do a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to get rid of sync 1, and then I'm going to route the palettes, or the parents. They're not palettes yet, they're parents. I'm going to route those back from the output back to the input of the combiner. And so now, instead of going to a sink, they will simply route back around. And the last thing I need to do is change the arrival mode. So, well, I'm going to change the arrival process. So I can leave it in arrival time. I'm going to say, let's create 4. And then I'm going to have a stopping condition as the maximum arrivals being 1. And so what this will do is immediately at time 0 create 4 parent entities. And then because the maximum arrivals is set to 1, it won't create any more. And so those 4 parents will circulate around the system. So if we run, oops, here we go. So you can see we have, let me go back and change this guy. We hadn't changed that to allow passing to false. So let's do that. And then also let me move this a little bit further back so you can see them. And so now when we run the model, we have 4 entities that are created. They're all sitting in this queue. It's a little difficult to see, so let me just expand the queue here so that we can see them all in the parent input queue. So now we are essentially modeling a reusable palette, recirculating palette, where we have arriving entities. And as I mentioned, this will set us up for the workshop, which we'll cover in the next video. Before ending this video, though, a couple of recommendations for extended learning. First, on the combiner, explore a little bit more of this batch specified quantities of multiple entities, similar to what we saw in the second sim bit. Control the behavior when the combiner fails. We didn't look at that, but it's something you should certainly experiment with. And then control over the seizing and reallocating of the resource. With the separator, we can explicitly decide which members to separate using a match condition, similar to what we saw in the match condition in the combiner. and we can also have detail control over, again, the seizing and reallocation of the resource object. And as always, look to the help in some of the advanced training materials for more information on how to do these. But as always, you also want to just explore. So open up Simio, plop down a combiner and a separator, and just do some exploration of the different alternatives.